Hey guys, Brass Facts here. Without question, rhetoric regarding a potential civil war looming in the United States has been louder than it has ever been in recent memory. Where battleground of ideas isn't just about taxes, foreign policy, and if the blue or red guy should be in the hot seat, but for what it feels like for the first time in a long time, a fundamental disagreement on how people should live their lives. With compromise between these factions not just not forthcoming, but actively condemned as the American center left and right are beginning to be despised almost more than the actual opposition. Compromise is now viewed as a losing strategy, and polls are clear. Even the non-hardcore types are like 50% sure that we will have a civil war in our lifetime. The biggest critique of the recent movie, aptly named Civil War, is that Texas and California were bros, not the premise of a nationwide conflict being remotely far-fetched, or the fact that that movie just sucked so much ass. We seem primed for a civil war in our lifetime. Who knows? But the theory I most often see, not just by quote-unquote normies, but the prepared individuals, those that are actually seeking out to prepare for something like this and are investing genuine money, is essentially an American Civil War too, with the nation fragmenting, potentially balkanizing, and different factions emerging and fighting for either independence or control of the nation. But that is the premise of this video. I do not think this will occur. I don't think the Civil War will be a war. There won't be an open armed conflict against two or more groups managed by competing states or nations that were once united. There will be no easy to define geographic lines, no organized military units, no outright competing for territory or resources. There will be no win condition. Instead, if we do have an upcoming civil war, and that's already a big if, it will be brutish, undefined, terroristic, and long-term. Which, by the way, I'm aware that that is also considered a civil war, but I'm talking about war, which is a big reason why I think in political science we're shifting away from calling it a civil war and instead calling it an internal conflict, right? Because it's slightly different. Whatever. We interrupt this Brass Facts political science ramblings, and by we, I mean me, it's just me, to bring you this guy right here. This is my Flux 365, and as you can see, it's got a really sick paint job on it, namely DNC. DNC is not the Democratic National Convention, as I keep confusing it as, but Digital Night Vision Camo. It's that camo that was like kind of digified in green, and it's meant to hack Russian night vision units. That didn't happen, but it ends up being a really cool camo that us gun nerds kind of fawn over, and of course I think it's neat. And this Flux was DNC-ified by Alice Customs. Customs with a K, mind you. So if you ever feel the need to spruce up some of your firearms, be it you don't have the balls to spray paint it, or you just want something that's a little more coherent and lasts the rigors of, say, EDC or just normal gear usage, well, you can head over to Alice Customs and get a custom Cerakote job, be it a one-tone, two-tone, or maybe a more complex design like this. Thanks, Modern Warriors. Back to whatever this video is. I think it's the political science one. So there are three major reasons why I don't think an upcoming civil war will take the form of a sort of traditional, X versus Y war, and will instead more approximate what we've seen in ethnic conflicts with nations with weak central governments, or that internal conflict as I mentioned earlier. The first is mostly a non-answer, but must bear repeating in conversations like this. Will the Civil War not be a war because, well, it just won't happen? At first glance, my personal reaction to that is, what? Bro, did you hear the opener? Ideological difference have never been higher. On top of that, inequality is at sky-high levels, and whoever is in the hot seat seems to be putting more energy in blaming the other guy instead of actually working the damn problem of my grocery bill somehow outpacing the 10% inflation that apparently didn't happen. But the political science in me comes out and says, from an academic standpoint at least, there's a pretty damn compelling reason as to why nothing will happen. Nothing ever happens! No, really. I mean, at least worth listening to. While there are just as many theories as there are civil wars, and predicting them is basically impossible, there are some common themes observed across a wide range of them. Inequality matters a lot less than you think, strength of institution matters much more than you think, and quality of life of the average individual must be much worse, combined with signs of change, followed by a threat to this change. It's not enough that times are bad or that a nation has competing groups that don't get along. There has to be enough of a compelling reason such that not just the youth is willing to risk their future, but more importantly, the average Joe Schmo who has something to live for is also willing to do the same and essentially sacrifice the well-established life and family. But things can change, and I think most individuals are aware of the ground shifting beneath their feet. So that leads me to the other two reasons in the premise of this video. Let's just assume we will get a civil war. What might that look like? People like to point to balkanization or the First American Civil War, and while this scenario could manifest on a longer timescale, presently it's just not possible, as the United States lacks clear and defined subnations within the states. As anyone that has followed the election knows, the divide instead is city versus everything else. But even that is not clear-cut. Most of the US population lives in what would historically be defined as a city, and only a small percentage of the population actually lives in what you probably imagine in your head as a true rural country boys. Furthermore, what you probably imagine as a deeply red or blue state is actually not that deep, with most extreme cases ending up as a 60-40 divide, with most states looking close to a 50-50 split with a rounding error. So not only can we not create a north versus south situation, a west versus east, even a regional split, we can't even neatly split up the states themselves into red versus blue. So on that alone, the ability for a traditional X versus Y territorial type civil war to occur is just not possible right now. But let's put that aside for a second and play devil's advocate to get to my third point. After all, for example, picking it out of a hat, the Chinese Civil War was very much a rural versus urban divide. There exists a historical precedent of this occurring in the past when nations, roughly in the US current configuration, undergoes a long period of self-purging, where each enclave looks inward to destroy or force out smaller opposing enclaves within itself, sort of purifying itself, for the lack of a better term. I wish I could find this article. It's been lost to time and I've referenced it so many times. But that situation of that 60-40 ends up looking a lot more like an 80-20 after this period. So let's just say we do end up having the precursors for a civil war, which we don't, and let's pretend that there exists sufficiently large lines to draw division along, or divisions along, which we also don't have. There is another problem to a large civil war as typically imagined by the prepared citizen. We have, yes, the ideological left and the right, and these guys don't like each other right now. But we often forget that the federal government and the state governments exist. And while this is going to be unpopular to say because these are often weaponized as ammunition against the opposing side, both the federal and state government, by and large, are not interested in a civil war. While we can point to certain politically motivated individuals within the government, usually elected officials, by and large the government itself mostly is just a superorganism that exists to do one thing and one thing only, and that is perpetuate itself. Collect taxes, preserve the peace, and maintain the power and status quo of itself. Civil war is generally not a good thing for that. Unless, of course, the Civil War is about the government maintaining power, but that's not what we're talking about here today. Any scenario that does occur of left versus right is going to look a lot more like left versus right versus the federal government desperately trying to revert to mean Thunderdome Saturday Night Special. So what gives? Brass facts, what do you actually think will happen? Well, violence. Lots of violence. You're sort of beginning to experience some of it now, the precursor to it, if you will. I don't even need to explain it, it's becoming more obvious by the day as rhetoric is dialed to 27,000. And the normalization of violence doesn't just get a blind eye, but praise a lot of time. It's hard to say when we cross this threshold. But looking at other nations embroiled in a similar situation, we know what the outcome might entail. Mass targeted violence, not just criminal gangs or economic purposes, but simply to send a message, not because of what you have, but because of who you are, or generally who they think you are. And then once the violence happens, we get retaliatory violence, and then we get retaliatory violence, and then we get retaliatory violence on the retaliatory violence that was for retaliatory violence, and blah, 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 blah. All the while, the federal government is increasingly getting more desperate and cranking its violence up to match the situation. So why do I go over all this? Well, I think a lot of the preparedness community has a misunderstanding of what the highest likelihood outcome of a upcoming civil conflict might look like. Because it's, let's be frank, you've seen the type, peak male fantasy to buy all this gun gear and then imagine that a state government is going to recruit you to help fight those libtards over there. And as such, preparedness has taken a very odd direction, as well as rhetoric, where people expect a Ukraine type situation where civilians sort of just get drafted as is and then just kind of get the do fighting, on top of ultimately being able to still expect a resupply from a larger organized force. If we're actually honest with ourselves, given the current paradigm, a upcoming conflict, if we're going to have one, is most likely going to be kind of boring by comparison, or the lack of a better term. On the daily news, you will notice a ton of violence, more than we've ever seen in our lifetime across the nation. But from a day-to-day perspective, you're still going to the grocery store, you're still going to work, you still need to go to the laundromat, whatever. You may go for months without seeing a single violent moment, followed by finding yourself embroiled in the middle of what amounts to a spontaneous political gang war. Those in your circle may ask you to target people, you may be the target of others, and no one really is safe when the only qualifier to violence is you're either with me or you're against me. And shit, maybe you even do everything right and then the government hits you in the face with a beanbag round just because you happen to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. Worst of all, there probably will not be an end in sight, as these scenarios don't really have an endgame. Closing out this video, I want to be sure to say, you can't really predict long-term future. So I'm not saying a traditional showdown of a fractured United States isn't possible. Prepare for it if you feel like it is. I just think it's less possible than other competing predictions. And it pays to consider things that are outside of the main narrative here and there. At the end of the day, who knows? Just be flexible in your preparedness. Hopefully I've offered an alternative perspective of what a potential conflict in the United States might look like and given you something to mull over. Alright, thanks for watching. We'll see you guys later.